Welcome to the first lecture of Anth 220 Nutritional Anthropology. Let's just jump right into it for this first lecture. I kind of touched on this during my introduction video last week, but what is nutritional anthropology? Now, when you think about nutritional anthropology, you probably think about food and eating. But of course, as many of you touched on in your intro posts, you know that food and eating is much more complicated than that. There are layers of culture. I also asked last week in that video intro post for you to write down and think about these two sentences. A, this person lives to eat, and B, this person eats to live. The first one kind of being accusatory, somebody loves food too much. The second one kind of being accusatory, that someone doesn't love food enough, right? Of course you know that you have to eat to live, right? That you have to obtain the proper nutrients in order to survive. But we also know that food is more than just nutrients. So these two sentences reveal the extremes in food culture, certainly within our culture. And it reveals this interplay between food as a biological necessity, but also wrapped up in behavioral and cultural and social meanings in terms of its consumption and its availability. And what that adds up to is nutritional anthropology. It's the study of the interplay of biological and social forces that shape food use and nutritional status at multiple scales, the individual and the population scale certainly. Nutritional anthropology is also interdisciplinary. It's an interdisciplinary approach to nutritional status. Now, all of those are words that you know, and maybe this is something that you know, but I'm going to take a few seconds and break that down. You know what interdisciplinary is, so we're looking at multiple disciplines: human physiology, cultural anthropology, biological anthropology, geography, etc., etc. And nutritional status. I mean, you have variation. You have variation in food, you have variation in nutrients, you have different external environments, you have different internal environments, you have different cultural components in terms of food and food taboos and food use. You have different access to food and availability to food. Many of you are surviving on a budget because you are university students, right? So you know that impact as well. So all of this variation in amount and quality of food leads to variation in nutritional status. And your nutritional status affects your life. It's related to your health. It's related to your energy levels, whether you feel fit or you feel tired. It's related to your activity and tolerance and how you're able to function. Briefly, we can visualize nutritional anthropology through a graph. When we think of food, many of us tend to think of the biological needs at the individual level. So something like that center box, the individual biological and physiological needs, diet. Or maybe some of us tend to think of culture, the idea systems, the ideas and the perceptions that we have about food, the preferences of food, and how food is used in terms of a social barrier or a bridge, the use of food in social interaction. Now there is also the social environment. This is the environment in which we live, and you can have many scales, so You have American society, or the Eugene community, or the campus community. Can be organizations like political or institutional or economic. And these social environments can affect the physical environment. And the physical environment can be things, of course, like climate, water cycles, soil, carbon, phenology cycles, the flora and fauna and wildlife, and the food web, and how all this adds up to food production. But the physical environment can also include things like, for example, sexism and racism. Environmental sexism or environmental racism. For example, lead in your water or lead in the paint. And that's not something that's just been going on for the last 10 years. That's been going on for several hundreds of years in the U.S. And discrimination does have an impact on diet and health. We also have components of technology. This can be things like agriculture practices or food preparation like cooking and dining. I think our book might give us the example of a corn diet and health problems related to a heavy corn diet, pellagra, which is a lack of niacin, but certain cooking techniques can reduce the risks of pellagra. Now, when you study anthropology or nutritional anthropology, you can focus on any one of these aspects and their relationship to nutritional status. A strictly bio perspective would focus on physical environment and technology. A strictly cultural perspective would focus more on the social organizations, idea systems, and the social environment. But nutritional anthropology tries to bridge these gaps. It is interdisciplinary. It is a biocultural discipline, focusing on the interactions of all of these things together. But guess what? Nutritional anthropology is more than that. Nutritional anthropologists study food systems. And we do this in a multifaceted way. First of all, food systems are what we just talked about in the last slide, that graphic of nutritional anthropology. But food systems can be more than that. So food systems, in terms of a definition, are cultural beliefs, the social institutions, and the social environment that influences the physical environment, the production, distribution, and the consumption of food. It's a long definition. What does that mean? Well, think about that graphic. But food systems are even more than that. You need to add in food acquisition, what you might know as subsistence systems. Things like hunter-gatherer, pastoralism, agricultural, industrial agricultural systems. And these aspects of social organization and structure affect food. Human beings and our entire genus, the genus Homo, going back 2.5 million years, and our entire branch of evolution, known as hominins, going back 7 million years or more, have lived and evolved in hunter-gatherer subsistence systems, not cultivating plants and animals, not until very recently. So we are collecting food and water. And if you're living from the land, then generally you'll need to live in smaller groups, partly because of the natural distribution of foods. And you'll need to be nomadic or semi-nomadic because of the natural migration of animals and the seasonal variation of foods. In this class, we're going to look at foods eaten by hunter-gatherers, and we're going to look at the time spent procuring food. And think about that. How much time does it take to acquire food as a hunter-gatherer? We'll also look at the nutritional status of living in hunter-gatherer subsistence systems. And ask yourself that question as well. Is a hunter-gatherer more nutritionally deficient than someone living in an agricultural subsistence system. So we'll look at aspects of these multiple components. Next, pastoralism, or the herding of animals. Similar to the hunter-gatherer subsistence system, these societies tend to be smaller, maybe around a few hundred individuals, and some are nomadic because these are people that need to follow animals or herd animals. Generally, that means you're going to lack permanent structures, the building of permanent housing, and not cultivating the natural vegetation to keep animals in a certain area. Others tend to be more semi-nomadic or maybe seasonally nomadic. But the diets of both are based around the animals that they live with, and often around the animal products. So it's not just the meat, but it can be things like milk and blood. And it can also involve trade. Generally, these subsistence systems involve trade with horticulturalists and agricultural societies for plant foods. My guess is that when you think of food systems, you probably think of agriculture, at least as one of the first food systems to come to mind. Agriculture, around 15,000 years ago, began to emerge as a food system. And certainly by about 2,000 to 3,000 years ago, we have most, not all, but most of the societies around the world are partially to fully dependent on cultivation to meet their food needs and their daily energy requirements. The agricultural revolution has had significant effects on our ecology and our biology. This includes everything from quantifiable, measurable physical changes to our faces and bodies, which we'll talk about, and of course to diet, nutrition, nutritional status, disease, health, and social and societal organization, all of which we'll explore at least briefly in this course. Now, we just talked about hunter-gatherers. Social interaction for hunter-gatherers was heavily influenced by food availability. But you don't have that problem in agricultural societies, or at least we don't tend to think of it in that way. You have, or some people have, lots of food that can sustain a larger population, from a few thousand, maybe up to 1 million or more. So we're not talking about these smaller villages. We're talking about larger villages and city-states. You have the emergence of state societies, in which some people control power, right? They control the power, they control the products, they control maybe the technology of production, and other people who are generally producing those products, and often a surplus of those products, i.e. the food, might lack the means of control. And that can lead to a wide range of difference in nutritional status. And of course you have technology which is rapidly developing at this time. And last, we have industrialized agriculture. This combines agriculture with mechanized industrial production of goods. Both food and non-nutritive food or non-food crops through the use of fossil fuels. So we have mass food crops, and we also have non-food crops like tea and tobacco and coffee, etc. Industrialized agriculture uses this mechanical equipment to help till the land, harvest the crops, and distribute food to locations that, in many cases in our society today, are incredibly far away, not just throughout the US, but halfway around the world. With industrialized agriculture being so massive, we have a similar trend in population density and in environmental impact. Agriculture and agricultural societies also have an impact on the environment, but in industrialized agriculture, it has a much greater impact. In other words, we have population densities that are much greater than natural carrying capacity in terms of a localized area, and the amount of land required, the destruction to that land, and the change that can cause, the amount of energy used in this process, and the resulting chemical changes. All of this has not just changed the environment or the climate, but it's now led to, in some cases, a crisis situation. Nutritional status in these societies can be extremely variable. Why? Well, it partly depends on social stratification. Things like access to food, income level, local versus state scales, purchasing power, of course, environmental change, climate and the effects on crops, the stock market, the fluctuations of the stock market, etc., etc., etc. Suddenly, what you're talking about is globalization and global issues. Now, you may not think about it, but these issues have real nutritional consequences, which we will explore briefly in the class. Now, I want you to know a little bit about those food systems. I mean, it would make a good quiz question, right? But despite all that diversity in food systems, and what that means in terms of diet and food and nutritional status, there are some basics of human nutrition and some basics of human diet that unite all of those systems. First, and you may not think about it, but we are highly omnivorous. Now, I know that some people are vegetarian or vegan, and some people eat a lot of meat, but as a species and as a hominin, we do not tend to specialize on just one food item. In other words, we don't just eat leaves like folivores. We don't just eat fruit like frugivores, or insects like insectivores, or meat like carnivores. We eat a lot of different things. And it turns out that we are adapted to that sort of a diet. And we're not just adapted to an omnivorous diet, but an omnivorous diet suggests we are adaptable. To be an omnivore is to be adaptable. Second, all humans cook. Now, that doesn't mean that all food is cooked, but at least some food is in all human populations. And that doesn't mean that some food is cooked every day, but in general, part of the regular diet, right? And you can do this in many ways. You can do this by boiling or roasting or frying or steaming, etc. Third, there's an increased food preparation time. We eat, right? We don't just eat and run away, although it may seem like that sometimes. I grew up in a house with 5 siblings. Dinners at my house were seemed to be more eat and run, but there's a whole process there, right? We prepare it, we cook it, we have fires. It takes time to make the food, and to keep that fire going, and to keep the fire at the right temperature. We add spices and salts and peppers and herbs to the food as we cook it to change or enhance or mask the flavors of food. And we do these things much more than any other organism. And related to that, we have these elaborate systems of food distribution and sharing and exchange. And we can find that complexity in any of those subsistence systems, especially today, right, where a product from one part might be mostly used in another part of the world due to trade and economies, etc. But even more simple than that, we share food. Food brings people together, which some of you talked about in your intro posts. And last, which I'll talk about an example briefly, and hopefully you've read about the example in our book. We have these food cultures, and you know what that means, even if I don't write preferences or prohibitions up there. We grow up in culture, including these perceptions of food. Now, whether that's a local culture or a national culture, you have these multiple layers of the culture of food. There is an understanding of cultural norms and taboos. Some foods are acceptable to eat. Some foods are more than acceptable. They are preferred. And others are unacceptable. They're prohibited. For example, in the U.S. society, a lot of people eat cow and don't think about it. And a lot of people also do not eat cats or dogs. In other cultures, it is not okay to eat cow. And this culture of food is often associated with other aspects of society. So it's been used to describe human variation, for example, to support various biases based on class or race or sex. All right, the next 4 slides are going to be a brief summary of the 4 chapters I wanted you to read in our book. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about each of these slides or each of those chapters, because you can simply read that yourself. And I'll give you a few broad questions at the end of this that I want you to think about. But this will just give you a taste of the diversity and the complexity of nutritional anthropology. And the first chapter, I could probably spend 15 minutes just talking about this, and I would like to, but I'm really going to keep myself in check. Eating Christmas in the Kalahari. A Canadian anthropologist from the University of Toronto, Professor Lee, studied the hunter-gatherer society that were at the time known as the Kum. And he tells the story that he was out in the field for a long time doing great research, collected data. We'll read about some of his data later. Coming to the end of his research period in the field, and he wanted to throw this big party, a big celebration to say thank you to everyone for sharing their information with him about hunter-gatherer lifestyles. And so what he did was he threw a big party. He went out and he bought the biggest, fattest ox that his money could buy, and he planned to slaughter it and have this big feast with various villages. Everyone would come together and celebrate over food. I mean, this is his perception, right? And the reaction of the Kum people to the ox that he bought, when they found out that he bought it, was not what Richard expected, right? People joked about how inadequate his gift was, how thin and old and too little meat and mostly bones, and that the celebration would be a disaster and people would go hungry. And this really worried Richard, or Professor Lee. And some people even said that he was inciting violence during the celebration by not having such a great ox to provide. Richard only realized that this was sort of a joke being played on him, that the ox was actually full of fat and meat, when he cut into that during the feast to share with the people, with his friends. For Richard, the celebration was on Christmas Day, and Christmas was about friendship and love, and this joke seemed almost cruel to him. And he couldn't understand why. Now, Christmas means the same thing for the Kum people, but in the Kum culture, pride is not valued. Pride is the individual. It's an individual thing. It's I am better than you. I brag about this or that because I deserve more. I am superior, you are inferior. And for the Kung, that can lead to someone thinking not only that they're better than someone, but it can lead to physical violence. It can lead to harm. It can even lead to death. Now, most of you can understand this. For the Kung, humility, not pride, humility is more important. Humility, it's about sharing, it's about living in a community and working together as a team. So his friends, Richard's friends, told him that the Kung criticize each other. They insult each other. They belittle each other. You might know this as, taking the piss out of someone. And some of you might even know this as part of your own culture or subculture. And then that may have a different reason. Sometimes it's for building rapport, but the principle is the same. The idea to keep things level. Different perceptions, not just of food, but of all the meanings around food. The next chapter I wanted you to read is No Heads, No Feet, No Monkeys, No Dogs by Dr. Chicken, Miriam Chicken, who studied economics in the Philippines. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this story. I'll do much less on this one. It's a topic that I can relate to very easily. Food taboos differ depending on different places or different cultures. And again, some people may look at a cow or a monkey or a dog as food, and others don't. But it's not even, those lines aren't even as clear as we may think they are. And we'll get into that a little bit later. That even within a culture, for example, in the United States, eating a cow, some people have no qualms about it. Other people do. And there are food taboos related to that. You have a diversity of opinions. And that can make things much more complex, but also very interesting. The next chapter that you'll read about is From Hunger Foods to Heritage Foods, Challenges to Food Localization in Lao, PDR, or Laos, as we might call it here. Some of you may have traveled to or lived in Lao, or have family from Lao. I certainly have spent some time there as well. So this is another one of those chapters that brings back a lot of memories for me. Dr. Penny Van Esterick wrote this chapter about her studies regarding economics of food in Laos. Specifically, she's writing about rice and river algae and cassava chips. These, what traditionally would have been known as lower income foods that are transformed in a global market to something organic and specialized heritage foods, and they become something completely different. But underneath that is this backdrop of economics. So in Laos, 40% of children under 5 are underweight, which is a form of malnutrition. 41% of children are stunted, also a form of malnutrition, a more chronic form. And 15% of children are wasted. That's when your muscles and your fat waste away. Your body basically begins to break itself down to keep itself alive. Another severe form of malnutrition. These values by themselves may not mean much until you provide a comparative context. So let's look at the numbers for the U.S. Only 3.5% underweight, 2% stunted, and between 1 and 2% wasting, depending on which area you look at or which study you analyze. Okay, one more example I want to give you, and this one is not coming from your book, actually. I think this one will be fun and interesting, and at least some of you will like this. So, how many kilocalories, or calories, which is actually kilocalories, are in that meal? Here I've got this image. I couldn't find a better one, but this will have to do. An image of a frozen dinner of Oriental style shrimp and rice. Now, it claims on the box that it's 230 calories. I don't know about you, but I've certainly eaten something like this before. How do we know that it is actually 230 kilocalories? Now, all of these dietary claims on frozen foods like this, things like under 300 calories and, eat great and lose more, fewer calories, etc., etc. How do we know what's actually in there? And you can test this. Now, we can't do this online, but in a laboratory setting, we can do something like this. And step one would be to homogenize the food. You blend it up, make it into baby food, and then you dry that to get an estimate of water. And you can test for fats by using various acids to separate fat from other nutrients, and alcohol to dissolve the fat. And then you can test for proteins and fibers and carbohydrates and all of the micronutrients, the vitamins and the minerals. And you can calculate calories by testing for calories, which is just a measure of energy. It's a form of energy. So you can test the amount of energy, which is heat in food. You can heat up the food to a specific temperature, and the food starts to release heat. It releases energy. So the more energy you have in food, the more macronutrients you have in food, the more energy that will be released. And you can calculate that energy by heat. And we'll go over aspects of that later on, but we call that energy in food, that food energy, calories. So what you can do is you can take your frozen dinner and you can test it for calories, right, in a few samples, and then take the average. Then correlate that to the weight of the total weight of the mush, or the total weight of the food. Now, in one calculation, this was off by nearly 20 calories. It was, in fact, 250 kilocalories, not 230. Now, you might be saying, so what? It's still close. I mean, it's not exact. But why is it not exact? Why are we being told it's 230 when in fact it's 250 kilocalories inside that frozen dinner? And part of the reason is, at least in the United States, is that fiber might be or might not be included in a calorie report. The USDA does not have a standard regarding reporting and including fiber. Fiber is cellulose. We cannot access the energy in cellulose. It's there, but we don't have the ability to access it. So some companies decide to calculate fiber and subtract that from the calories reported. Others do not bother with that because that takes more time and more money to do that. Now, are you actually eating 250 calories? Or are you eating 230 calories? Well, I mean, you may be eating 250 calories, but you're only accessing 230 kilocalories, depending on if cellulose or fiber is included. Another issue is you have rounding and extrapolating. And think about this for a bit. If you have 1% of your food mush in a testing tin, and the calories you get in that 1%, say that's 2.399. 2.399. Now you may round that up and say it is, or down rather, 2.399, you can say that that's 2 calories. And then you can extrapolate that to the total food and say it's 200 calories in that 100% of food. 200 calories in 100% of food because you have 2 calories in 1%, right? But in fact, it's 2.399 calories. So what happened to the 0.399? More accurately, you would have to increase that value, right? We tend to be more precise when it comes to animal feed than human food because animals have to receive an exact amount of food with the exact right amounts of protein to carbohydrates to fiber ratios, because very often our domestic livestock only get one type of food, just one, and that's it, and that has to be exact. But if you take that 2.399 rather than the 2.0 rounded and you extrapolate the exact value, you get 239.9 calories, not 200. Suddenly you're off by 40 calories of that food. You may report 200, but in fact it is 240. The thing is, at least here in this culture, you don't know which companies are doing these calculations. Not in terms of the companies doing it, how they're doing the calculations. If they're rounding or extrapolating, how they're doing that, if they're including fiber, if they're including cellulose in the fiber, it creates complexity. This slide just presents you a few broader perspective questions. So while you are reading those chapters, you can think about these types of questions, because you'll get questions like this, especially when we start reading more in the book. This first week or rather the second week and this third week, we don't have a lot of readings from the book, but once we start doing the chapters, I want you to start thinking about nutritional anthropology. And these questions will help you access that in these intro chapters. Okay, this is just the first part of the lectures for this week. And I'm going to stop here and challenge you to take the quiz. Now, this quiz is for no points. It's just sort of a fun quiz to get you used to how to take quizzes. But you can access this quiz and take it today, depending on when you're listening to this. It could be Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Generally, our quizzes are going to only be open on Thursday and Friday, and only open for 4 hours. But this is going to be something a bit more flexible and a lot more fun. You're not going to be penalized for any wrong answer. I just want to give you a number of engaging questions and to challenge some of your food knowledge and maybe misconceptions about food. Okay, once you get done with that, if you decide to take the fun quiz now, go ahead and watch the other lectures this week. Okay, we'll see you next lecture.